I mean, if you want to like look at it from 50,000 feet, how are we doing as a country, as a society? How much we've sandbagged ourselves by first having actual barriers to people for whom there shouldn't be barriers for anybody. Number one.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Humanity 2.0 podcast. Today's episode is amazing, as you already know, but it is amazing for me because I know this guest. I know him. He is one of the most amazing educators that I've ever seen in my life, still is. And everyone loves him. I love him. You'll love him. So let's meet him. Andrew McBurney, thank you so much for being here today. How are you?
I'm doing good, Vanessa, and thank you for asking me to be on the show. And happy holidays.
Yes. Happy holidays to you. The New Year's is coming up. Do you have any resolutions or?
A lot of the resolutions are sort of the same ones. Make a more concerted effort at exercising, in particular swimming. I've got a membership at a gym that has a decent pool, so there's really no excuse for me not to get in it. And then I want to do more cooking for myself, because when you do more cooking for yourself, that's healthier. And even though I'm in a lot better shape than I've been in for the last 20 years, I could still do more. And I've always wanted to, be a good cook. So.
Yeah. When I look for gyms, I look for which one has the best sauna, which one has like the best after workout, not really necessarily for the after, but more so just because sometimes I might want to do that instead. And then there's a lot of cooking apps out there, a lot of tutorials that you can learn from now. So it's no longer just Julia Child's books, right?
Right. Well, and I bought a couple of books recently that I think are going to be helpful for me. And one of them is specifically a cookbook for people with ADHD that actually, I was diagnosed with ADHD like 3-4 years ago. Surprise. And it's very helpful because it actually explains things. And not that I need the explanation, to be able to follow the steps of a recipe, because, it's basically chemistry. But to know what the parts are doing is very helpful for developing your abilities as, a cook, as opposed to somebody that's just following a recipe.
Yeah, very true. I'm so curious. So with your diagnoses, did you look back on your life and kind of connect the dots? Like these are moments where it may have been more prevalent than others?
Yes, but that wasn't the first thing. The first thing was, as time went on, and have a number of former students that I'm friends with, and they go off and do different things. And I stay in touch with a lot of former students. So as adults, I would have conversations with some of them where we would talk about like how our brains work and certain things we have in common and that kind of thing. And then there were a couple of them that as adults, now they're now in their 30s. But they went to their doctor referred them to a clinical psychologist. They got diagnosed with ADHD, and I started thinking to myself, maybe, the joke, adult onset ADHD, maybe it's not a joke, and maybe it's not adult onset. And so I went to my doctor and I said, I think maybe, and he wrote me out a referral, went to the clinical psychologist, went through the battery of tests, and he was like, oh yes. And then now the funniest thing was when I told my parents, as I called my mom to let her know. Now, understand, my mom came from a family of like stoic Midwestern farmers. And it's like, you didn't go to the doctor for anything because there wasn't a doctor around, but and so growing up, it was like, what do you need to go see a doctor for? Or just saying, oh, it's probably nothing. That's not what she said. She said, well, you were kind of a handful. And I was like, okay. And then I called my dad and he said, well, you didn't get it from your mother. And I'm like, dang, that makes so much more sense now. And then really started thinking back on like all the things where it's like, yep. And even would tell friends, hey, I got diagnosed, and they're like, Andy, I knew you were ADHD when, X, Y, and Z. So just the knowledge of it and learning more about it has been very helpful in managing. And I'm also on medication, although it's the lowest dose for this particular medication. And it was one of those things where I was like, wow, y'all are like this all the time? Y'all can actually focus and not have to get up every 15 minutes. So yeah, it's been kind of interesting. It's been helpful.
Would you say that you've embraced that part of you now and it kind of highlights who you are?
Oh, yeah. And there's like people will say out there that, oh, being HD means you have a superpower. It's like, well, yes and no. I mean, there's a lot of conditions that people have where you could look at them as superpowers, but for human beings, any superpower is a double-edged sword. And so it is, I'm more aware of the superpower side of it, and then I'm also aware of the, this is the foot stepping on my cape side of it and yanking me back. And I want to say there've been a couple times that because of shortages of medications and insurance companies being insurance companies that, I would go a week or two without the medication. And I've been able to manage better than if I hadn't been diagnosed at all, because simply the knowledge just itself has been very, very helpful in having a greater understanding of how my brain works.
There's quite a few people that have awesome techniques, right, for when you're not medicated. And I imagine that also helps as well.
Yeah, I actually started a long time ago. Sometimes I would have trouble remembering tasks as the jobs I was in, especially when I became an instructional specialist. There were more things I had to remember. There were more things I had to get done, even though it's, being a teacher is a full-time job, and having 6 classes, 25 to 30 students each, you have enough to be getting on with. But with being like in an instructional leadership position, there's more moving parts that you have to worry about. And so that was kind of catching up to me, because I'd been pretty good about remembering stuff in my head or just jotting down a few things here or there. But I started, because if I was just writing stuff on paper, it was getting, so it's like, oh, okay, I'll write this down on a Post-it note and I'll keep it in my pocket so I'll remember. I'd wash it. I wouldn't remember it was there. So I started buying these little notebooks that are short pocket sized and just like page a day. And it's like, this is what I got to get done today, notes to self, things like that. And I've got them going all the way back to 2007. And that's been helpful. That's been like one of the bigger things. People that I work with now kind of joke at me. It's like, Andy and his little notebook. Yeah, Andy and his little notebook. It's how I get shit done. So.
It's Andy and his handy dandy get shit done book.
Yeah, it is. It really is.
I love that. So normally I would start off the episode with questions, but I want to stay here for a moment. Your background in education, like I said, many students speak highly of you. I speak highly of you, and it's the proof in the work. You put so much of yourself into any student that you had in front of you. And it was very transparent that you cared about the students, not only just about the history or whatever it was that you were teaching, but you were just so honest and so upfront. I think they appreciated that and they resonated with your transparency. How did you become a badass in education?
So, well, thank you. That part of it specifically wasn't something that I really thought about in advance. I was, students are people. I mean, they're not adults yet, but they're still people. They're going to be having families and voting and having a job, and some of them going to college. I was comparatively lucky because in all of my education, there was only a couple of teachers that I had that would like talk down to students. But then as a teacher, sometimes you see some teachers and where it's like, you don't like kids. Why? You should do something that makes you happy. And so that part of it, I have to say, I didn't really think much about. My first years at John Jay, I was overwhelmingly concerned with figuring out, okay, what's the best way to teach certain things, or what's a creative way to teach certain things to get kids to like higher levels of learning, higher levels of thinking, which it became immediately apparent to me kids were definitely capable of, but not always asked to. And I've had other former students say that to me, that it's like mainly the way you treated us as adults, and that some of the times it was like life lessons I imparted, sometimes without really realizing that's what I was doing. But I thought, that's just I don't know, that's just how I was raised. It's when, our mother and father had some experience that they learned from, whether they learned the hard way or they did something right and they recognized, well, I did something right, and they would share this with us. So I just do it too. And that's, to me, like I never really thought, and in all my years in education, wow, I actually said that phrase. In all my years in education, it has been emphasized the importance of building relationships, appropriate relationships with students. And it's like, yeah, and realize that, okay, there's some people that have trouble with that. And some of those people are people that probably shouldn't be teaching because they don't like kids to begin with. But some of those people, they do want to be good teachers. And it may be a fair amount for them to like overcome and learn in order to figure out how best to relate to students who may be sometimes not even 5, 10 years younger than they are. And so it's really just going in knowing you've got a classroom full of people that are going to be out there. And yeah, we're sort of locked into this factory model. And honestly, we're locked in ways much more so than when you were in school, when I first started teaching. And I'm going to say there's more drawbacks than benefits to it, but we can still learn. And if I'm teaching like sophomores, you're 3 years away from getting pushed out of the nest, so to speak. And I don't want to say that school isn't the real world. I don't like the phrase, oh, when you go off into the real world. No, this is part of the real world. And do I wish that in education, sometimes we would do maybe more real world things, like more field trips or internships or things like that, even for high school students? Yes, absolutely. And that's it. It's just starting from people are people. And as teachers, we have the younger version sitting in front of us.
Did it ever feel just really heavy observing your students and seeing what they were living through and then trying to get through to them with whatever content or whatever syllabus that you were working through?
Yes. My first year's teaching, and I imagine this is true for anybody that's a teacher, steep learning curve. And I said this before, that I feel like I've learned more from my students than they learned from me. And I think that that's true. There were some things that surprised me, and not in a good way, when I became a teacher. And that includes things like the number of students that lived in an abusive household, or the kind of conditions that some students lived in, like homeless students. And like, what are the conditions of them being homeless? Are they going from couch to couch, or are they literally living under an overpass? And maybe as teachers, and I tried to become sensitive to this early on when this realization hit, that there's certain things that teachers might say that they don't mean anything bad by it, but still don't say it. Things like, school's over. Why don't you all go home? Because like we're on duty in the courtyard or in the bus loop or whatever. And it's like, y'all go home. Don't you want to go home? It's like some of them, no, they don't. Some of them, even when a teacher's yelling at them, even when they're sitting in an AP's office, this is the best part of their day. Or things like some teachers, like let's say there's a student who could benefit from deodorant. There may be a reason why they don't have any. And it's not because they don't know that it's important. And they're walking in the building incredibly self-conscious. And so if you have a student like that, I know there's some teachers that don't think twice. They just gut reacts like, what, are you raised in a barn? It's like, don't say that. And so there's a lot of things, and those are comparatively little to the circumstances that cause them being homeless or being in a very troubled home that they come from. And so when you realize that, and especially because I had mostly seniors, it was juniors and seniors, I was probably more willing than some other teachers to like cut kids a break. So when a kid says, I didn't get this finished, can I turn this into you Monday? Yeah, it's fine. Sure. And, and I think I had a policy of taking points off for late work, but I never really enforced it.
I remember a student in particular in one of your classes who was the smartest person in the entire senior class, I believe it was. And he eventually ended up being homeless and having a really bad home life. Him being there every class period we knew that he was okay because he was in your class. So that was a really big deal for some people.
Yeah.
Do you remember what I was like as a student?
Yes. And I say yes, and it's, there are memories that stand out. There's memories that fade. I remember you as being very conscientious, very, very keen on taking responsibility for whatever you needed to do, and for taking responsibility for your actions. I mean, and as far as grades, as I recall, you got pretty good grades. You got your work done. But I remember you as being very conscientious. And I
Thank
have to
you.
say that as a characteristic, that tends to stand out a lot. That because there are some students that, even though they may be good students, they still have the attitude of, oh, okay, this is school, I get to screw around at least a little bit. And then, okay, I'm not shoved out of the nest yet. But then there are other students for whom it's, no, I'm already in the real world and this is part of it. And if anything is worth doing, it's worth doing well. And I'm going to be a decent human being to other human beings. And so those kinds of qualities tend to stand out in the memory.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That is very kind of you. No one's ever said conscientious, so thank you for that. Still like that. I'm curious, do you also have memories of the good standout moments of where these kids went from to becoming like really awesome, like that you're very proud of? Do you think of those moments, and what's one of those?
Oh, let me think about that. And at John Jay, can we say the name of the school?
Yeah,
Okay.
totally
Yeah.
can.
So the students at John Jay, when I left Jay and after everybody graduated, we didn't have social media. We didn't really have a way of immediately keeping up with one another. And so I didn't, I didn't reconnect with a lot until social media came around. And I will always appreciate social media for that, even if I don't always care for the people running it. And there are definitely some that I'm going to say some that stand out to me are those that served in the military, because they didn't know it at the time, but they were in our military when the war on terror began. They were already there and they served through it, and not everybody made it back. I will also say that there's a student of mine that I reconnected with just a few years ago, who was going through some health issues, and I've sort of followed along, and and we had coffee and caught up, but I've been following along on her social media, and she's really turned things around for herself, and she's done it herself, and she leads classes for people and things like that, and it's really encouraging to see. And then there's also a former student of mine who is now mayor of San Antonio that stands out. But even before that, and her bio is out there, Gina Jones. So she went into the military. Well, she went to college, I think, Boston College or Boston University, and was in the Air Force and was doing Air Force intelligence during the war on terror. So, you can imagine. Well, actually, we can't imagine. That's kind of the point. And eventually was a deputy secretary of the Air Force, and is now mayor of San Antonio, and is, I think, discovering the challenges that go with being mayor of the seventh largest city in the United States. And I'm going to say this isn't a Gina thing. This is a San Antonio thing. And if you're from San Antonio, you're going to know what I'm talking about. San Antonio is the seventh largest city in the United States, but it acts like maybe the 130th largest city in the United States. It definitely has a small town feel. There are small town vibes, and there are, in many things, some small town mentalities. And so any city will have competing interests and factions. And not that San Antonios are unique. We have our own. San Antonio is the way it is. And it's the same thing that's like and I remember this even at John Jay, a lot of students were like, man, I can't wait to get out of this city. And then they get out of the city and they're like, man, I miss HEB. Like, how do people live? Like, look at this. And other places where it's like they go to another part of the country and they think that people are just mean. And it's like, they're not mean. That's just their baseline. It's just like, we're in general friendlier. And maybe we're, because it used to be sometimes you, and I've noticed this more and more recently, that maybe you're on like a 2-lane road in the hill country or something, or out in the farm country south of town or wherever, and you pass by somebody and you just wave. It's just the hand up on the steering wheel. Some people still do that, not everybody. Or let's say you're going up and it's a 2-lane road, and the person behind you wants to go faster, and you're in the middle of nowhere, and so you just sort of move onto the shoulder and they pass you. Number one, people don't really do that anymore. But number two, if somebody did that for you, as soon as you finish passing them, you just sort of wave in the window, and people don't do that anymore. And so I don't know, because not all of these people can have come from out of state, and so I think that's just something that hopefully we're not totally losing.
Yeah. I don't think we ever, or I don't think San Antonio ever will, not to cut you off.
No, sure.
But I was one of those kids. I was one of those kids that was like, get me out of here as soon as possible. So in my little brain, getting out of here was going to TCU. And so, because Fort Worth is so far and it's so foreign. And I did end up coming back
Fort
plenty
Worth
of
is
times.
very cosmopolitan.
And then the stockyards, don't even get me started on that. But they're not real. Yeah, so I remember moving and wanting to get out as quick as I possibly could. And then every chance that I got, I would ultimately come to that realization like, oh, I miss home. I miss the people. I miss the food, first and foremost, and my family and my friends. And I still feel that way. I moved to Dallas eventually. It is what it is, but there's no place that comes close to the people and the authenticity that you experience and just how real people are. And they'll tell you to your face, if they're not happy with you or with your ideals. And I remember Gina Jones, I marched with her in ROTC. So I remember her quite well.
Yeah.
And I'm so happy for her that she's in that position. And I can't wait to see what she does with the city of San Antonio. But I do know that there is quite the struggle for her with the other politicians who have been in office for long term in that city with the older mentality that things cannot change. So I'm really interested to see what happens with that.
Well, and San Antonio, and this is not meant to cast any aspersions on any particular politicians, but developers in the greater San Antonio area have always had a lot of influence on city politics, and sometimes good and sometimes ill. And I'm going to say, well, for example, like the Alamo, with what's been going on with the Alamo there. So for a long time, for people who don't know, the Alamo, Shrine of Texas Liberty, but, in the 1800s, it got to the point that there was like a dry goods grocer in a building that was built on top of the Long Barracks. It was just there. I mean, it was just there in Alamo Plaza. It was a thing that people knew about, but didn't really do anything. And it was falling into disrepair. And it was the Daughters of the Republic of Texas that, organized, hey, we've got to keep up this the Alamo. But the city built up around like two focal points: Main Plaza, which is where San Fernando Cathedral is, and the Bexar County Courthouse, and then and City Hall, and then Alamo Plaza. I mean, it is the center of town. Yes, it's a battlefield, but it's also the center of town. And it had been that way for a long time. And so, the Alamo was kept up, but, you would hear these stories of like people coming to see the Alamo and they're like disappointed that it was so small. And it's like, dude, we didn't build it for you. People died here. It's the Shrine of Texas Liberty. And several years ago, and I don't know who exactly was behind it, because you never know who exactly is behind it. But there was this push to turn Alamo Plaza into, they had, they felt something needed to be done. And by this time, the General Land Office gets involved, state of Texas. And and there were a lot of suggestions, and there was sort of a draft plan. But then the final plan that got proposed that the city was going to vote on one April or May was like, where the hell did this come from? Because it would have, the Houston Street, which runs north on Alamo Plaza, it goes east to west, but it's the northern boundary of Alamo Plaza. There would have been a right there, that would have been solid, no entrance. And then in the south end, there would be another glass wall. And these glass walls would sort of mimic where the walls of the original courtyard were. And there would be one entrance and exit point. And it was like, but it'll be free. We just want to control who's going to be there, but it would be free. And they were going to tear out all of the trees in Alamo Plaza that had been growing there for 100 years. They were going to move the cenotaph and try to recreate the court. Basically, they wanted to sort of turn the Alamo into a life-size theme park of itself. like a life-size diorama of itself. And it's like, and a lot of people were like, what? And so the city council meeting got flooded. They had to have with people coming in to speak against it. They had to have another meeting about it, and they eventually voted against it. Now, what they're doing now, I think, is a lot better, where they've recreated some of the south wall and the palisade. Maybe it's not called palisade, but the wooden fence part where, you know, Davy Crockett was. And they're building up the Crockett block of buildings across the street. Is going to be collect together. They're going to become a museum, and I think that's a lot better. But it's an example of how there was that, like, where did this glass wall plan come from? And so, you know, you have that sometimes. So I'm going to say that there's going to be issues that if she hasn't already, you know, encountered them, Gina's going to have her work cut out for her. Should say
Yeah, for
the mayor,
sure.
Mayor Jones, is going to have her work cut out
Mayor
for her.
Jones, Mayor G. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm so glad that they did not do that wall partition. I remember learning about it and being so mad about it. So I'm so glad that did not continue. That's awesome. Goodness. Last San Antonio business, HEB. I said the same thing when I moved from San Antonio, but now HEB is everywhere. It's in Plano, it's in Frisco, it's literally everywhere. So I'm so happy. Normally I ask questions about humanity. At this point, we're like at 4 or 5, but to kick that off, I would love to ask you some random questions just to get familiar. So first off, what is a weird talent or something that you are notoriously good at that nobody knows about?
Well, okay. I can't say that nobody knows about this, but I have started telling students at the beginning of every semester that one of my superpowers, that I have a superpower. I can put people to sleep with just the sound of my voice.
What's something that you're notoriously bad at?
Oh gosh, I'm going to say giving gifts. And I hate that. That is something I need to be better at. I've tried to be better at. There's been like 2, maybe 3 times in my life that I really nailed it, that I really did a good job. But most of the time it's like, you know, I have to like rack my brain. And what I should have been doing, I could actually be really good at giving gifts when I'm having conversations with people and they mention something and I need to just train my brain to write that down. And yeah, and that's something that I'm going to say I still need to work at. You know, and I'm thinking there's another thing, and it's not exactly an unknown thing, but it's being able to write curriculum. So now this is going to be like, you know, if you're not in education, you know, you're like, so what? So when I started teaching, you know, we had state standards. It wasn't the TEKS, it was the essential elements. And the curriculum, instruction, and assessment that went on in your classroom was entirely up to you, beginning to end. And so when I sat down to plan out a course, I didn't already have what we call a pacing guide or scope sequence or year at a glance with all the units sort of laid out. I got to design it. And at John Jay, we had, for example, for U.S. history, we had a lot of teachers teach U.S. history in chronological order, but there were other teachers that chose to do it thematically. And I mean, that was fine. You could do that. And how you did assessments was up to you. There was no, like, you weren't required to work as a team with the people that were also teaching the same course. You weren't required to have common assessments, but those things are now like standard. And most districts in Texas have their curriculums for each course built out. Now, one of the things that I like about the current district that I'm in for social studies, for each course, we have teams of people working on the curriculum writing that involve instructional deans, which is what my position is. I'm basically a department chair, but instructional coach. So deans are involved, but teachers are involved, specialists are involved. And we have these groups, and sometimes they meet on their own, and sometimes we meet all together, and we talk about like sort of strands that go through the course and things like that. And so we have younger teachers that can do curriculum, they can write curriculum, but for some, it requires more of their own education and training and effort to learn about elements of curriculum writing. Whereas, you know, anybody that started teaching when I started teaching, like the curriculum piece was up to you too. Uh-huh. And so I'm writing curriculum for my courses like every semester. And so that's, you know, it's not a dying art, but it doesn't show up, you know, the way that it used to. And for newer teachers today, it is not something that's normally expected of them. And so if they're going to do it, and I'm glad I work in a district where, if teachers are interested in it, they have an opportunity. But there's learning that they're going to have to do about it that they wouldn't necessarily hit the ground with.
That's actually something that I really wanted to ask you about. What is your level of outrage with the education system and how the government is starting to do more and more restrictions?
So I am in favor of having an accountability system because it is true that there were some schools in the state that were just passing kids along, but there were also schools that weren't and that were doing a phenomenal job. No Child Left Behind and No Child Left Behind. And people, here's an overriding issue regarding education in the United States. There are 51 systems of public education in the United States. Each state has their own, and then there's the DC public schools. And there are similarities, but there's also differences. And with No Child Left Behind, the federal requirements were that, states needed to have an accountability system in place that needed to have like these elements. But other than that, it left to each state how they were going to do it. And so not everybody's accountability system looks the same. Ours in Texas, we really got locked in to, testing now, testing forever, test them all. And it is detrimental. I mean, I think there is, you get burned out from all the tests. We were giving like high stakes standardized tests to the kindergartners, first graders, second graders. And it's like, and so consequently, for some schools, and it's usually lower socioeconomic schools where kids are going to have, a rougher time. Well, I want to be vague. I want to be specific. Kids that grow up in lower socioeconomic areas, they're more likely to have parents work more likely to have a single parent, more likely to have, if they have both parents are working multiple jobs. So parents aren't always there.
Uh-huh.
Parents don't have a lot of money. They're trying to put food on the table. And so there's not as many opportunities. And if the kid has babysitting duties, they need to tend to their siblings and that kind of thing. They don't necessarily have a lot of time at home to work on stuff. And some people may come from, middle class or upper middle class background and say, well, you're describing my life. Yeah. Okay. But if you're middle class, upper middle class, your parents have money, more money than what we're talking about. We're in lower socioeconomic areas. It is a question of, are we able to put food on the table? It is a question of when the students eat breakfast and lunch at school, especially if they get free and reduced lunch, that's the main thing that they're eating that day for a lot of kids. And so that puts hurdles in their path. Because those kids can be just as bright, just as sharp, just as gifted as kids anywhere else, but there's more hurdles in their path. In lower socioeconomic areas, that's where you tend to see schools that maybe don't do as well on test scores. Also, and this is important, lower socioeconomic areas, harder to pay for health care, including prenatal care and pediatricians. And so you have administrators across the state, I'm not picking on anybody in particular, at elementary schools. Now, at elementary schools, there are state standards for all the core subjects, English and reading, math, science, social studies, history, but it's mainly math and reading that are tested. And so there's a lot of elementary schools where that's what they teach. You may have like history hour on Friday, and that's the history that you learn. But you don't really learn. It's like a little episode you get to see once a week. Some of these schools are basically test prep.
Uh-huh.
And I understand the attitude. The attitude is, if this is what our scores are based on, and, this determines whether or not I get fired, or this determines whether or not, we have TEA come in, why would we spend any time on anything else? And TEA can say all they want, well, they shouldn't do that. Okay. Guess what? You can't make them stop. And unless we do something different. And so there are a lot of middle schools and high schools that are getting kids in who absolutely hate reading And for them, learning is something that happens outside of, like, actual learning is something that happens outside of school. And you're just like trained to pass a test. And so consequently, the learning that we want to do in middle schools and high schools, if the kids are coming in and they really are just burned out and really do not like anything that goes on at school 8 hours a day, that makes it an uphill battle. And that's what's been created in a lot of places. And the other thing about the accountability, and again, I'm in favor of having accountability system, but putting all your eggs in the basket of massive multiple choice tests are the worst way to assess what someone has learned besides a true-false test. And there are experts who will say, no, that's wrong. It is actually the best way. No, they're incorrect. Multiple choice tests are only good at measuring what they're capable of measuring. We have state standards that ask the students to analyze something, okay? And so there will be multiple choice questions that line up with those standards. So, okay, we're asking the kid to analyze here. No, you're not in a multiple choice test. Analyzing is an open-ended process. It's a process. It's open-ended, actual analyzing. At best, you can say, well, we're testing an element of analysis. I will tell you that for Bloom's taxonomy, that the two, like lowest levels, still very important, knowledge comprehension. I mean, they become a foundation for the other levels. But they're in a single question, except for like in English where they have to do writing, and now in history there's short constructive response. But for the multiple choice and even for the quote unquote star 2.0 questions, there isn't a single one of them that's actually at a higher level than comprehension, and really barely even that. Multiple choice tests are the worst, and it was always known they're the worst way to measuring something. That's why at John Jay, by the late 90s, so I get hired there. Some of the other new teachers, we were hired at the same time in the 95-96 school year. By the late 90s, we're thinking about, like, we did multiple choice tests for unit exams and stuff just because, like, well, that's what our teachers did for us sometimes. We were thinking about, like, ditching those entirely and, like, what do we want to have kids really do to demonstrate what they've learned? And we were leaning toward what's called portfolio assessments, where there's certain things that you have the kids do to demonstrate their knowledge. It could be an essay or research project or paper, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller. And then at the end of each semester, they collect and they have a choice of what they want to put in there, but maybe you haven't put in 3 things or 4 things. And they can revise them and clean them up and present them as, here's what I've learned. And that's your semester exam. We were talking about moving in that direction, and then, the state locks us in to, assembly line, factory model education. And so a lot of what I feel a lot of educators have been trying to do, and this is teachers, counselors, administrators, is figure out how can we still really teach kids? How can we still have kids really learn in spite of the fact that we have this testing?
Yeah, those tests really create a lot of anxiety too, and a lot of bad feelings for the students, because you walk in thinking like, oh, I'm going to fail. And so you have that automatic dread, but then you carry those feelings beyond the test scores because you see those results and you're like, oh, see, told you, I failed. Going back to what you were talking about, socioeconomics and coming up in a lower income household, I was definitely one of those kids. And I don't know if you ever knew that or not, but I was working full-time job as a waitress all the way through high school just to live, in addition to doing all of my studies and extracurriculars. But at the same time, the extracurriculars and enjoying classes like yours and some other teachers, that saved me, I think, from getting outside of my surroundings and really trying to push myself to go further. I never expected to go to college. It wasn't even part of the plan until I met the GT people and some of the other AP teachers. So I that wasn't part of my life plan. But then after getting into college, I also had a rude awakening, finding out that, if you don't come from a prep school, if you don't come from another school where you have just 24/7 immersion in these like greater studies, and I wasn't prepared either. I mean, even though I had AP courses, I still struggled to keep up with kids that went to private schools their whole life. So it was really difficult to kind of assimilate into that environment, but I still held on to, what I had learned before and who I knew that I could be. Growing up in that kind of environment, it was, I don't know, it's just part of my path. And you made me think about that a little bit, about being, a single parent family and having to survive on next to nothing.
Well, and stories like yours are always very gratifying to hear that. And this was one of the greatest things. My first year at John Jay was going to graduation, was helping to work graduation. When you realize how important it was to these kids' families and how proud these kids were of what they accomplished, no matter how they acted in school, sometimes how proud they were that they made it out, and how proud their parents and their grandparents and their tias and tios and cousins, and because they were all there and they were all cheering like it was a Spurs championship game. And that was really powerful. And, and there's some kids that didn't go to college. There's some kids that got a job right out, but they've achieved they've achieved success. They've been able to, put a roof over their head, have a family, and provide for them. And their kids are going to be going to college. And for some people, I don't want to, because like for some people, it's like, if you don't want to go to college, don't go to college. I mean, if you are really happy working in this field, I mean, do that. But because I don't want to make it sound like, everybody needs to go to college. If you don't want to, I mean, there's good paying jobs. You should do what you love. But to see students that have bettered themselves, that have achieved a certain amount of success or success based on their definition of success, that are making things better for their kids than the way things were for them. That's always, I mean, gratifying, yes, but more so inspiring. I mean, that tells you that in spite of all of the things working against actual learning, people are still making it happen.
Yeah, very true. And actually, I didn't even finish.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I went for 2 years and then I ran out of money. Grants, loans, scholarships. I had everything and it wasn't enough for TCU. And so I went home and I decided, okay, well, what's the next best thing I can do to help people? So I joined AmeriCorps, went to Seattle, worked with kids up there through the City Year Project, and then came back to Texas. And then eventually, 15 plus years later, I went back to college in 2020. And so I attended a Dallas college here, and it was like part of like the best few years that I spent just making films and making TV shows and being really creative, but also embracing the other, classes as well, and revisiting communication skills and history. And it was so much fun. But I remember going back to school at the very beginning, 2020, and this is like during COVID, right? And I thought that, man, how do you start over? How do you like unpause your college education? These kids are going to be so much smarter, but they weren't.
Definitely.
The life skills, topped everything, and I aced everything. And then I started doing my production work and traveling the country and interviewing strangers and doing so much with videography that I had to pause my second time degree. So I've technically been working on a 2-year degree for like 4 years.
And there's nothing wrong with that. I was the first. So my parents, okay. So I remember when I was in school, a lot of the kids, we were middle class, but a lot of the kids, we were expecting to go to college. That's the friend circle I was in. And we would joke that, San Antonio College is San Pedro High, and sort of like look down on anybody that was going to go to community college. And that was such horseshit. My parents both started off at a community college, Flint Junior College. Both of them transferred then to the University of Michigan. My mom got a master's degree from the University of Michigan, and my dad went to University of Michigan Medical School. So whenever I've had students ask me about, well, what do you think about maybe I should just start off at the community college? Yeah, there's zero things wrong with that. I went all 4 years, actually 4 years plus a little bit, because didn't have great grades at UT, and I liked UT. I liked going to UT, but it probably would have been better for me if I had started off at a community college for a couple of years and then transferred. Community college, there's nothing wrong with starting at a community college.
Yeah, I totally agree. I kind of wish that I had went to SAC actually, because they have like one of the best radio programs. And my thing was radio, TV, and film. And so that would have been like the absolute best place. I always wanted to be on KSYM. And so I really should have done that. I just saved so much money.
Saying that you would want to do radio, television, film, or that you could have started at SAC.
Yes, yes, I would have done so well there. And I remember like the last year of school listening to KSYM so much and thinking like, man, it would be so amazing to be on that station. And for some reason, one of my trio program instructors or advisors, she brought up TCU and was like, oh, they need minorities, go here. And I thought, okay, cool. And that was the worst decision ever.
Well, okay, so first, I got something to say about that, but let me first say KSYM and KRTU, the Trinity radio station, those are the two main radio stations I listen to here in San Antonio. KSYM is still a great radio station. Over the years, I've had people tell me that I have a good voice for radio, and I can't hear that. I just hear my voice resonating through my own skull, and whenever I hear a recording of myself, I'm like, I mean, it's better now, but I kind of I've always liked the idea of like, put me on the overnight, let me just play like spin Texas blues records and do an overnight. And that I would love doing that, middle of the night, you've got maybe 5 listeners, but it matters, you're the voice out there in the darkness.
Yeah, you should talk to them. I'm sure they would totally have you on.
Yeah, I've thought about it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you were talking about teaching, you said you're teaching government?
So, yeah, I have ended up teaching government, AP government and government more than any other course, although I've taught just about every social studies course at least once or twice. Now, dual credit government. So dual credit is where it's college. I mean, it's a college course, but you're doing it in high school. But if you're teaching it, that means that you either have a master's in that subject and the community college has hired you, or you have at least 18 hours of graduate credit in that subject, which is what I have, plus some other advanced degree. And for me, the other advanced degree is the law degree, and I've also got a master's of education. And so that allows me to do it. I was doing it in Houston, too, when I went back to the classroom. In fact, that's where I first started doing it. So there it was in conjunction with Houston Community College. And it's really cool. I basically teach it the same way I teach AP, because AP is intended to be freshman level. So it's just that, probably shouldn't say this out loud, but like, don't let the community college people hear you say that you teach it like AP, and don't let the college board people, hear that you teach it like in community college, because there's a rivalry, among community colleges and college board. But it's like, no, it's the same. I mean, if it's intended to be freshman level government, this is how I teach it. So I teach it more or less the same way. But they're in Houston, at Houston Community College, the department chair also asked me if I would teach sections of government, federal government and Texas government at night. And I said, sure. I mean, it was nice to have that extra money, but I will also say that it's one of my best experiences is teaching community college at night, because in any given classroom, I had students from 18 to 54. I had a couple of students that were older than me occasionally. And it was students who were right out of high school, and it was students who were coming back to finish their degree, or students who were going to college, who were in their 30s or 40s and were at a point where now I'm ready to get a college degree. So, and I want to go back and say that about the whole, college isn't for everybody. And some people may just not be interested in college. They may have very steady employment or doing something that they want to do that doesn't need a college degree, and that's absolutely fine. And for some people, it is, not everybody has to go. If you want to go to college, not everybody has to do it right out of the gate. You don't have to do it right after high school, even though you'd probably get a lot of advice that, oh, no, you should do it right after high school. For some people, it's better for them if they do it later for various reasons. And sometimes, and I want to go back. So this is the other thing I wanted to mention. There's a lot of advice that adults will give students that is very well intentioned, that, oh no, you should go to TCU, because to pick that as an example, that, okay, that's, a big 4-year institution as opposed to a community college. I don't knock the community colleges. The idea that a community college would be, your second choice unless it's your only choice is no. I mean, there are pros and cons to going anywhere for each person in their circumstances. And so, everybody at the very least, when they are, sophomores, juniors, because that's when you should be thinking about if you want to go to college next or what you're going to do next. And if college is on the list, they should have community colleges on the list as something to consider.
And I feel like it's also a time to question which place, university or community college, is going to serve you best.
Absolutely.
Not what you're going to do for them or what accolades that they have. I wish I would have thought of that. I wish I would have known to think beyond, just this crest that you can pay for. And also agree with not going right away. I wish I would have taken a year off because, I worked full time all the way through and did so many things. I needed a break and I really didn't get that break. I started going, before we graduated high school, and I was moving into the dorms that same weekend. So I never really had a break, but I think that taking a break is actually an excellent advice. So now we want to get into the 8 degrees of humanity, probably less than 8. So are you ready for this? When you hear the word humanity, what is the first word or image or story that comes to mind for you?
So a story. Well, okay, the first word is love. There's a story that I could tell of this was an elderly lady who had a husband who was in a wheelchair, and they were going to be going into a restaurant, and she had asked someone for her husband. So her husband didn't like being a burden. Felt he was a burden because he was in a wheelchair, and they were supposed to be meeting, I think, their son. And the son was a little late, but they wanted to just she wanted to just go into the restaurant, but somebody needed to help get him out of the car or into the wheelchair, and because she wasn't physically able to do it. And so she asked for some help for that, and they got help, and he was wheeled in. And she had asked the person to just say that you're like a friend of mine or whatever, and that you're somebody that, so it's not like, so the guy doesn't know that she's just asked a total stranger. But what struck me about that was she's 70, 80 something years old. And it was really a lesson in how you're going to live your life. She went right up to a stranger and asked for help and said, and can you play along a little bit for this, for the benefit of my husband, to help with his, I don't want to say pride, because it's not pride, because he didn't want to be a bother. And I suppose some people, by the time they're in their 70s or 80s, they could be very mistrustful, not like other people, and not like asking anything of other people, and could be miserable. And that's a very sad thing. Or you can just, live your life, put yourself out there, and just the way that she didn't even hesitate to just go up to somebody to ask for help. And that's, I remember thinking as I'm witnessing this, imagining me as a 70 or 80-year-old, it's like, am I going to have the attitude of like, I live in a society with people, and we're all in this together? Or am I going to be, just sort of like sitting in a room, angry, reading a book, not wanting to, and there's nothing wrong with reading, of course, but not wanting to, engage with anybody or talk to anybody or that sort of thing. And so that to me was a pretty profound way of looking at how you want to live in the society that we're in, a society, and how you want to treat it. And the other thing about the guy, reason why he was in a wheelchair is he'd been in World War II. He was a Marine, and he was on the Bataan Death March in the Philippines. He didn't have use of his legs from the time he was 19 years old. He'd been in a wheelchair his whole adult life. Made a life for himself, didn't want to be a bother. And so, yeah, you want a story about humanity, that couple is a pretty good example.
That's a beautiful story. Kind of ventured off into thinking about, if someone were to become negative and just wanted to sit in their room and read versus being part of humanity, I have to think about what got them there. Is it part of their lived experience? Did they experience like significant adversity or negativity that just pushed them inward, or is it something else?
Yeah, no, and that's something I've thought about too, because Is it because I know that there are people older than me that have experienced a lot of negativity, but they are irrepressible. They're not going to let anything get them down. And whatever crises they've had, through their lives, they've come out the other side and they've maintained their positivity. But there are some people for whom, yeah, they may go through things that are too much. And that's something that we also have to remember when we encounter people who themselves are, adults and should behave better, but are just angry and whatever. And people need to, yeah, I mean, I'm not apologizing for them. People need to take responsibility for their actions and be decent human beings. But at the same time, understanding is very important. Understanding is not excusing, but understanding is very important.
Agreed. And so we all have moments of shared humanness where another person or soul reminds us of our shared humanness. Can you recall a person or a story where you experienced just that?
So in the past, I've worked with a teacher who could come across as pretty abrasive, sometimes inconsiderate without meaning to, or occasionally sort of like oh, why do I have to do this sort of attitude? But at the same time, it could also be somebody who was very dependable and the kind of person you'd want to have in your corner. And this was a teacher, and when you look at, however they were acting in the lunchroom, complaining about this or that, when you saw them in their classroom interacting with the kids, it's not that they were a completely different person, because you saw the elements of them there, that they were who they are, but they were just profoundly dedicated and very detail oriented in helping and supporting their students in a challenging class.
What subject did the teacher teach?
AP US History.
Interesting. You did the same. You were very good.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, I did AP US History 1 year it was for 1 year at John Jay. It was the 2000-2001 school year, which ended up being my last year at Jay, because then I went to Sunset full time, which was a school that was held at night.
Yeah, I do remember Sunset. It took me a minute to remember, but I do. And that's interesting. I was in that class that you taught at Jay, so that's amazing. Today's society often judges what we don't understand. Can you tell me what we do not understand about educators today versus who they were in the last decades?
Oh my gosh, I don't even know where to begin with that, because so many people talk about education like they didn't go to school here. People will talk about public education this and teachers that, and we're communist groomers and all of this, as if they themselves didn't go to school in the United States. Number one, teachers are people too. You're going to have some people, I'm going to say this, so some teachers are born teachers, okay, where even if they're not employed as teachers in a public or private school, they're still teachers in whatever it is that they do. They are teachers of the people around them. And then you have people who want to be good teachers, not necessarily born teachers, and they can become good teachers. They can become great teachers, but you have to recognize, you have to do a fair assessment of your own strengths and weaknesses and figure out what you need to do. And that means you need to be open to your own self-improvement. And for some people, you can see that they're good at that and they're great teachers, and other people, they're trying, it's a struggle, and other people don't even try. And that, in some respect, for any profession. And another thing about teaching, and this is also true for any profession, there's both an art and a science. And when we say the art of something, that is the area that science hasn't reached yet. I guess that's not to be totally cold-blooded about it, but there's a certain style that you can bring in to your profession, a certain amount of creativity that you can apply, a certain amount of creativity that you can apply that maybe others, don't have as much of. It's sort of an area that is not as well defined to say the art of a profession as opposed to just the science of a profession. But it's true for any profession, even engineering. I mean, because you can have engineers who are prodigy, who have a familiarity with, whether it's building material or something where it's, they look at it a different way. And it's not necessarily something expected of an engineer, but where they bring in, something more than just being good at what's in the textbook. And you definitely have that with teachers. Another thing is to recognize that all of the difficult things that Americans are going through now, socially, economically, teachers are right there with them. You know, there are teachers that struggled during the pandemic. There are teachers that after the pandemic, it wasn't the same. You know, it just, that coming back to work, it just wasn't the same. We had to do so many things differently during the hybrid year. And I'm not going to say that that's the only thing, just doing it, you know, how we did things differently in the hybrid year, whatever it was, that's part of it. But whatever it was, not everybody came out of that. And again, true in other professions too. So yeah, teachers are just like everybody else in that sense. There is more work in the job than I think some people realize, because some people who may not have a favorable opinion of teachers, maybe they just had teachers that did worksheets, just handed out whatever, graded things, handed them back, and then eventually you have a quiz or a test, and that's it. The teachers that say, "Oh, I don't take work home with me," and it's like, oh, okay, well, no, I mean, and there are teachers that are actually very good teachers that are able to say that, but then there's some teachers who are not especially good teachers who are like, "Oh no, you know, they don't pay me to do that," so and it's like, well, technically, yeah, we do, but and so maybe they had teachers like that, and so they think to themselves, well, you know, we don't really expect a lot from teachers, so why are they complaining about pay and whatever? And in their mind, teachers are more like a functionary rather than a professional, because they don't necessarily see all of the things that we are called upon to do as professionals.
Can you expand on that experience teaching during COVID? I'm so curious to hear about that.
Well, so first there was the spring of 2020, where once the NBA canceled stuff, you realize, you know, this shit just got real. And at first, spring break was going to extend a week, and then it was going to go into April. And then at some point, it was like, we're going to have to do this for the rest of the year, where we are going to be online as much as possible. And it was sort of a, you know, and the problem was, like, we could, with what we had available in our, you know, district issued laptops and everything, we could have assignments posted online, but not everybody had Wi-Fi access at home. And so our district actually made it so that you could we did it so that we collected the Chromebooks on campus. Administrators mainly did this. Teachers weren't asked to do this, but administrators, custodians collected Chromebooks on campus, and the district communicated to parents that if you wanted to have a Chromebook for your kid, you know, number one, that you could come have one issued to you. But then, you know, we couldn't have everywhere have Wi-Fi, but the campuses had Wi-Fi, and if you were in the parking lot, you could access the Wi-Fi. Less than ideal. But then there were most businesses were closed. And then there were, I want to say they did something where there were like, you could get not buy, but you could get a Wi-Fi hotspot or something. But there were always going to be some kid where that just wasn't an option. And so we needed to have paper versions of everything that parents could come pick up. And so we would send the PDF to the administrators and the administrative assistants who were there would print these out, and then they would see they printed out for themselves every last student's schedule. And then they organized the assignments by teacher and by course, so that when a parent drove up and they said, "This is my student," they pulled the kid's schedule, they figured out, okay, here are the hard copy assignments. And they sort of set that up on the fly, which is extraordinary. And they also did something eventually where they provided meals that you could pick up in the parking lots of certain campuses that our district's food services would have, like breakfast or lunches prepared, and you could pick those up. And then the next year was the hybrid year. And at the end of 2020, we didn't know for sure what 2020, 2021 was going to look like. And so it ends up being, at first, we're remote, where teachers come to campus, but we have certain protocols and protections in place, and wearing masks, and we're in our classrooms, and we had a different kind of schedule. We had a schedule where we were expected to be there at 8, but the first classes didn't begin until 10, and it was on Zoom. And students did not have to. Attendance could be asynchronous because the state allowed it, as long as you did something on. You didn't have to attend the Zoom as long as you did something that day. And then after the first 9 weeks, the state said you can now attend. And so we had some students back, but they were expected to wear masks. And so there was some so in one class, I might have 4 students in the classroom. I might have 25 students total, 4 in the classroom, 8 are online, and the others are not available at that time. And you had to sort of rework what you were going to do or what your lesson was to accommodate that as much as possible. And that's a challenge because that is integrating technology in a way we'd never done before, integrating multiple, because you've got in-person and online and asynchronous all at the same time, and trying to integrate that and try to make allowance, accommodate for that. And you still wanted, and I know a lot of teachers, it's we still want school to be good, for the kids. That, yeah, this is, less than ideal circumstances, but we want you to learn, that it's not just going to be jumping through the hoops, checking the boxes that we've done everything. We still want the learning to go on. And so a lot of teachers put in a lot of extra hours trying to figure out how to make that work. And then the next year is, the state of Texas more or less ordained that, okay, we're going to be back like nothing's happened. And this is important. There's a lot of kids, and this is especially true at the high schools, where some of the kids were asynchronous. They never were able to show up for a Zoom because they were at work. There were new jobs that had been created during the pandemic, like all of the grocery delivery, curbside, other types of businesses that were created during the pandemic. And kids are out there getting as many jobs as those can because maybe their parent or parents got furloughed from the job they were in. And so it's okay, we got to work doing something. So let's say you had a family of 4. Let's say you had mother, father, 17-year-old kid, and a 10-year-old kid. Okay. Well, the 10-year-old kid's going to be home pretty much most of the time. Maybe both mom and dad got furloughed, so now they're taking other jobs, maybe multiple jobs, whatever they can to keep the money coming in. And maybe their 17-year-old's got to work too. Because I know I had kids, and there was a student who was able to attend in person. And I talked to him about this, and he said, yeah, no, a lot of the high school students that were 16 or over were working at whatever jobs they could. And so they weren't there on Zoom during the day. They were doing stuff at 11 o'clock at night. Or sometimes they were on Zoom, but they had their microphone off and their camera off because they were at work. But they didn't want to get behind in their classes. So they were attending the Zoom while they're at work. And their employer let them do that as long as, cameras off and, they can just listen in their earbud. But they made that effort to do that. And so consequently, and this is COVID, you also had a lot of people dying, getting sick, severely sick, dying, grandparents dying, parents dying. And so you had a lot of kids coming back with that whole year was one long traumatic experience. And the trauma wasn't really dealt with or over, And so we have kids right now who were, I want to say this year's freshmen, they were in 5th grade when COVID happened. So they would have been the ones staying at home the whole time that, somebody had to be there in the house taking care of them and trying to do a year of elementary school or 6th grade virtual. So yeah, we are still in many ways dealing with the after effects of COVID, but not in ways that are visible on the surface.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I'd never thought about the fact that kids were taking on jobs. That is crazy to think about. My son graduated during COVID time. He had the strangest graduation, or actually, take it back. The year before, his best friend graduated, but we went to go support him. And so it was like Texas Motor Speedway here in the Denton area. And they fashioned it into a graduation hall. So you had all the chairs, but then all the parents were parked on the lawn in rows of cars, and you watched your kid graduate via the Jumbotron. It was the most strange graduation I've ever seen.
That's still kind of cool,
Yeah.
though.
It was pretty cool to drive on the track. I won't lie.
That's cool.
And so, but just watching him go through that learning experience with online, and then also watching him detach completely from school, from everyone, and just staying in his room and not wanting to come out, not wanting to talk to people. It was really interesting to see him go from this once budding theater tech to I don't want to talk to anyone and nothing matters. And so
Well, and
it was really interesting.
I know that there were some students for whom learning from home was like the best thing for them. They were students that had social anxiety, like as a real thing. I mean, they're not just making that up. And so school was always a struggle for them. And, their battery was burnt out by the end of the day. It's probably done by lunchtime. And so for whom, like, they were making some of their best grades during that year. And then they had to come back, and it was a lot for them to come back. And then there were people, though, for whom part of school, and they may have been like very good students, but part of school is a social interaction. Part of the learning was a social interaction. And to be deprived of that, and as much as we would try to sort of have that in a Zoom classroom, it's not the same. And that was incredibly difficult. And then there are some funny moments too, because I'm not wearing glasses right now, right? So I need glasses. I don't wear contacts, but and you'll also notice I had some bags under my eyes too. I didn't really have that before COVID, but because my face was planted on the screen for so much of the day, I would take my glasses off in order to look at the screen, and consequently I need bifocals now. I do have bifocals. I still have to get used to them. And yes, I know it's 5 years later, but leave me alone. And so I wouldn't, whenever the kids saw me on screen, I didn't have my glasses on. And so at the end of the semester, I had a student, his name was Sarah. She attended every Zoom. She was a great kid. And actually, let me back up. If a kid did not attend every Zoom, that doesn't mean they're not a great kid. I'm just saying on her own, she's a great kid. And she was not attending in person at the end of the semester, but the last week she came up because she had made stuff for her teachers, banana bread and cookies and things. And she wanted to give them to teachers. And so she comes in. I was not expecting her. She comes into the room, and of course I'm masked and I'm behind a desk, and there's only like 6 chairs in the room. And I'm like, Sarah. And she says, yeah, wait a minute. You wear glasses? I'm like, yeah, I just don't wear them on screen. And I didn't think about the whole time, she had seen none of my students that year realized that I wear glasses. And that's a minor thing, but it was one of those moments you just didn't see coming. So, and the banana bread was amazing too. And I'm very appreciative of that.
That sounds awesome. I mean, glasses are a huge part of you. So that's so funny that they don't know you without glasses.
Yeah.
But then you think about all the people that you met during COVID as well. And this is all you see. So then when you saw them in person, you're like, who are you? You mentioned loss, people losing people during COVID. I feel that that's a different type of grief that we really have yet to fully understand. My brother passed during COVID, and so dealing with that grief versus my mom, who passed very recently in January, I feel like they're two different types of grief, because it isn't, that they had a long-term illness or that they had a sudden heart attack. It's something that was completely, just random, and just how he was in the hospital, and then he was out of the hospital, and then he was back in, and then he was back out. And there was a period where there should have been home health care nurses to check in on the patients because the hospitals were overloaded. And so they sent everyone home. Well, he was supposed to have someone come check on him and they never did. And so he bled internally. And then by the time things got worse and he gets in the ambulance, he's gone. And so that happening so abruptly, and then me being 5 hours away and having to race like hell to get to San Antonio to even be there for certain parts, it was just, it's jarring. And it's still something I think that we process because it's not a regular death.
No, and I would be interested in, and I imagine, psychologists and other mental health professionals and sociologists and anthropologists could look at this, but I wonder if we all mentally sort of regard them as if they're war deaths, WAR, as if we were like deaths during wartime, because it's not the same. Now that doesn't mean obviously we're not being bombed, but there were hospitals that were overwhelmed. And I've often thought about the doctors and nurses and PCAs and lab techs and everybody, especially in some of those the bigger city hospitals that were overwhelmed. I mean, a lot of hospitals got overwhelmed, but where they were just absolutely at the end of their rope, and there's just like a stream of bodies going out the door as more people are coming in. And we know that, they were affected by it. And different people are affected different ways, and it's traumatic, and it was a sustained trauma, but it's not something that we really talk about. I mean, a lot of it has sort of like a World War II feeling to it, that in World War II, everybody knows somebody who was killed. There's family members that were killed in the war, whether it was in combat or due to an accident or something, but it was all due to the war effort. The whole country, was at war. And then after the war, okay, we're working on trying to get back to normal. And that's, who you lost is who you lost. And as we know, like a lot of the people that were in combat theaters that saw combat did not talk about it. The friends that they had made that they had lost, they just didn't talk about it. And it wasn't until late in their lives that many of them started opening up about it. And that's when Tom Brokaw wrote his book, The Greatest Generation, about some of the stories. But it has, COVID kind of has that feeling, the families who lost loved ones, the healthcare workers that had to deal with a lot of loss, trying to figure out a disease that they knew very little about, and just trying to manage as best they could in the middle of the fire. And then at some point we get to a point where it's like, okay, we've moved on now. And it's not really talked about much. People taking precautions is also not really talked about much. Whether or not there's a spike in new cases in different countries here and there is not really talked about much. And so that in and of itself, has had effects on our society, and I imagine will continue to do so.
Definitely. You also get sick now and you're wondering, is it the flu or is it COVID?
Right.
Is it the next variant? I have seen content about COVID and some documentaries about it, but you're right. It's not talked about enough. And that actually just makes me think about something that I would like to do. So thank you for that. Thank you. You'll get your credit and byline. So I want to talk about your why, the reason why you do what you do. So if you could tell us, what is your why behind the work that you do, and then tell everyone what you do.
So I'm a school teacher, and so I'm doing that part first. I have had instructional leadership positions, including being a specialist for a period of time. Currently, I'm an instructional dean, and for the district that I'm in, that basically means I'm a department chair instructional coach, but I also have classes that I teach, just a couple though. And so my why is, why become a teacher? And I think generally for any country, any society, education is the most important thing. And I have librarians and teachers in my family, and I love learning. And that's really the main thing, I think, for me is it's not just like, I have family members who are teachers. I mean, you can have family members who are in something and it's just not for you. But for me, I love learning, and I love sharing what I've learned. I like the idea that there are important life lessons and life lessons that matter from what you've been taught in science or English or, a history class. And I realized pretty quickly after I became a teacher. I mean, I mainly became a teacher because I expected I would love it, because I would love learning and continuing to learn and sharing the knowledge. But also I recognized that when I began teaching, it was in a critical period for public education in the United States. And by virtue of that, so not ordinarily always an important job, but very specifically for that time period, very important job. And we are not out of the critical period for public education in the United States. The reasons are different now, but it's still a critical period. When I started, let me back up. When I was in school, when I started high school, you could drop out when you were 16. And it was a few years before that, you could drop out after middle school. Not everybody was expected to go to high school. And if you were in high school and you were screwing around, I mean, they could just expel you, get the hell out. And there were not what we would think of as a lot of special education students or special education classes. And right there, actually, that is a big thing that people don't realize. It's not about teachers themselves, but about what special education is, students with special needs, students with 504s. We could do a whole show on that, and maybe should, because people should know. But with the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, which is the year I graduated high school, and then the IDEA, which the name escapes me, but the A stands for ACT, but it had to do with equity in education. Public schools were expected to provide educational opportunities for students with special needs. And students would be expected, the school would be expected to make sure that the students' educational opportunities were the least restrictive environment, all the way up to the best of their abilities. And that the default was to expect everybody to meet, state standards, and sometimes with accommodations, sometimes with modifications. And there's a difference between the two that we don't need to get into at the moment. And so when I started teaching, there were teachers that didn't think special ed kids should be there. And there's actually still some teachers that think that way, although I venture to say far fewer than there were 30 years ago. But it is what we have seen over the last 30 plus years is kids with special needs who have certain conditions, learning disabilities, who are able to nevertheless live a full life, even be employed, have jobs, go to college, who would not have done so otherwise, who would have been labeled, tagged, school is not for you, when in fact it is as much for them as anybody else. There are just certain accommodations, modifications that may need to be made. And I know that there will be people that say, well, if you're making accommodations, aren't you really dumbing it down for them? No. You're making accommodations, but the expectations are still there. And so people are just going to have to believe me when I tell them there are kids over the last 30 years that have been to college, that are gainfully employed, who, if this had been before IDEA was passed and before ADA was passed in regular schooling, they would have been tagged as, school is not for you, college is not for you. So no, it would have been a barrier. What you realize with that is just how much as a society, when we have expectations, I mean, not just actual barriers to anybody who is quote unquote not normal. Because normal's a bullshit word anyway. Nobody's normal. Nobody is average. That's what makes an average an average. But just how much we've sandbagged ourselves. I mean, if you want to look at it from 50,000 feet, how are we doing as a country, as a society, how much we've sandbagged ourselves by first having actual barriers to people for whom there shouldn't be barriers for anybody, number one, but where there shouldn't have been barriers, and kept them from living lives that they could have been living. But even now, with many barriers removed, there's still some people's expectation that can act as barrier. And I wish people could see how beneficial that is, not just for those individual students, but how it benefits us as a people, that we are more inclusive. Because why wouldn't we be? Because we can be. But for some people, that's still hard for them to get over, that there are people that are not like them in whatever way, that they just can't see as part of what they think society is. And people need to get over that, because you want to talk about humanity. It's enough that it just benefits those students individually, but it does also benefit society as a whole.
I had an ADA activist, excuse me, I had an ADA activist on the show not too long ago, and she said, quit asking, what can you do, and just do with us. Just don't come at it as I'm trying to help you, but I'm you. I'm beside you. What can we do together? And that was like the most amazing thing that she said that day. Well, she said a lot more, but it was pretty amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. That is a lot of information, but it was much needed. And I'm so glad that you just poured that out of you. It was wonderful. So my last question for you is one of my most favorite of all time. And I've spent so many years now asking it in various forms. But before I do that, before I get there, I just have to thank you again for being the best human. You are seriously one of the best humans, but also one of, I would say, my top 6 favorite educators of all time. And the way that you taught was very inspirational, and it made me want to be a great person in terms of how I interact with everyone around me. And because you were so honest and just human with us and on the level, even after school, I think I had you as well for a summer program, and seeing you as a person in the summertime was so jarring, but it was really interesting because you had great taste in music. But overall, just getting to know you, period, as a human to human is truly beneficial. I can't tell you how much of an impact you've had for me and for other people. And so truly just thank you for all the work that you've done and all that you currently do still. You've clearly been consistent and amazing in your educational path. So please do not ever stop being yourself. You are the best human, just saying.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate that very much.
Good. If you could share a message with humanity, what would that message be?
Well, it's really whether it's the, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, love thy neighbor. Just about every civilization, major civilization with works of philosophy or religion has had as a core value, treat people the way you would wish to be treated, love one another. And that is, that is fundamental to seeing each other as fellow human beings. That is, if we talk about what humanity is, and it's recognizing that, yes, we each have our own individualism, our own integrity, our own dignity, but we also have that as a group, and that it's love that is a key to everyone, if you will, where we see what we have that is shared among us, and that's the most important thing.
And it's fitting because you said love in the beginning. That was your first word. So very fitting. Thank you for sharing that. Is there anything additional that you would like to share with humanity that's just kind of burning inside?
Well, at the risk of seeming more mundane and detail-oriented, I think there are some long-term challenges that we're in the middle of facing, because we're in many ways, the so-called digital revolution is going to be as impactful as the Industrial Revolution was, in ways that has already begun, and we don't know where the tunnel is going, and to say nothing of a light being at the end of it. And there are many schools of thought about what direction things should go, and some people are saying that because of automation or AI or what have you, there are many jobs that are just going to be eliminated. And that's all the more reason why we should adopt something like universal basic income. Okay, but there's, I think that a civilization, and whether we're looking at the United States specifically or, different parts of the world, it seems like we don't have much of a vision of the future. that we don't have the kind of vision that it seems like we would have in the 30s, 40s of, what comes next for not just the United States, but for humanity. And whether it's lack of imagination or too many people are just trying to make ends meet or, and so we're not looking farther down the road or whatever. But there are some big picture things that I think we could be thinking about and should be thinking about that are missing. Like, what if we said something? What if we had a president who said, as a goal, it would have to be long term because it couldn't be just one president done. It would have to go through multiple Congresses, multiple presidencies. What if we said that we want as a goal for our economy that all labor is skilled labor, professional, technical, that there isn't a job for a human being. I mean, any job for a human being requires some level of training. And when we say unskilled labor, it still requires some level of training. But what I mean is where any kind of assembly line job, any kind of job that you could take anybody and train them to do that job, that what if we assume that all of those kinds of jobs are going to be automated and that everyone should have a professional or technical degree. So everyone has expertise in some area, in some career field. How do we make that happen? And I know there are some people who would say, well, you can't do that. That isn't going to happen. That's just not going to work. Well, bullshit, and we haven't tried. But what if we do that? What if we say, look, this is a future that's coming, or definitely a future that could come. And so why don't we start thinking about what we need to do to prepare for that and what the expectations are for that? And does that mean, doing some reconfiguration of the way colleges and universities work or public schools work in order for long-term goal, everybody to be gainfully employed, have a certain amount of expertise, and living, and being paid for it. And so living in, a fair degree of comfort. And I know there are people who believe that in a capitalist system, you always have to have poor people. And there are people that would profess to be communists that believe that that's true. And that's one of the reasons why they're communists. But there's also people that are capitalists that say, no, that has to happen. But there are other people that believe in free enterprise, free market, who say, well, it doesn't have to happen that way. So let's see what we can do. But I think increasingly we get preoccupied with, label and sound bites and memes and who's on whose side and that kind of thing. And so that is a major long-term thing that I think we should be thinking about and that we aren't not really on our radar right now.
Not at all. But, I agree. That would be amazing. I can't even imagine the quality of life and the impact that would have on everyone. So, yeah. Andy for president, saying.
Well, maybe one day.
Maybe not for president, but Andy for advisor to the president, maybe.
And it's going to depend on the president.
I know, right? It kind of makes me think, though, is there a time, and you'd be the best person to ask, is there a time in history where one president actually gave the idea and the next one carried it? Like they actually kept that same idea or initiative going?
Yes. To some extent, post-Civil War, civil rights. Now, definitely Andrew Johnson, after Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson was not a champion of civil rights. But Ulysses S. Grant, even though, yes, there was corruption in his administration, he was definitely about enforcing 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. Garfield, when Garfield was elected, he was going to carry that on. He was assassinated, unfortunately. And at that point, the Republican Party, which was younger, a lot of the abolitionists by that point had died. And so the civil rights eventually by the late 1800s was not as important to the Republican Party anymore. But for a period of time, it was post-Civil War. And then the other example I could think of is the Cold War. During the Cold War, even though post-World War II, there was campaigning, Democrats versus Republicans and that kind of thing. We more or less had a grand strategy, and that's actually a term. That's a thing. Having national strategy that doesn't really matter who's running the show. They are still more or less going to follow it because it is recognized by all factions, most factions, the most powerful factions in your country as being important. So we had stuff that was begun during the Truman administration for Truman Doctrine, containment of communism. That gets continued. It gets continued through Eisenhower. Eisenhower would have done it anyway, but then it gets carried on through the administrations of Kennedy and Johnson. And again, I mean, ups and downs, and we did some bad things during the Cold War in the name of fighting communism, but it was more or less, regardless of Democrats or Republicans, it was the containment strategy of doing something to put a stop to the spread of communism, was something that was a grand strategy that was carried on. That immediately comes to mind.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Now our audience can see how amazing you are in the classroom. Class has been in session. Well, thank you so much for spending the afternoon with me. Normally these shows run 30 to 45 minutes, but it has just been an ultimate pleasure having you and sitting with you. And I look forward to seeing you in San Antonio.
Oh, absolutely.
I probably may be there for sure.
And thank you very much, Vanessa, for this opportunity. I appreciate it.
Man, you're going to have to come back. You're going to have to come back
Anytime.
Another time for sure. Again. And for the rest of you guys, thank you for watching Humanity 2.0 podcast. Be sure to share, like, subscribe, do all the things with the buttons, but also look for Andy. He's on Facebook. You're going to have all these followers, these new followers.
Yeah. And I don't look like this. This is not my profile pic. My profile pic across all social media is a black and white photo of me as a 4-year-old working at a desk. Okay. That's pretty much me, and so I just leave it at that.
That's awesome. Well, again, look forward to seeing you soon. And for the rest of you guys, be good to other humans, and don't forget to, I don't know, what do we want to tell them don't forget to do?
Love one another.
Don't forget to love one another and vote when it's time to vote.
Absolutely.